Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third of a series of 6 talks on the MENA region. MENA stands for Middle East, North Africa. For the benefit of those of you who may be tuning in for the first time in this series, the North Africa part of the MENA region stretches from Morocco on the west, bordering on the Atlantic Ocean, to Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. The rest of the 17 countries of the MENA region are all in the Middle East from the standpoint of political and economic analysis, even though geographically Egypt is primarily in Africa. It interacts almost exclusively or primarily with the countries of the Middle East rather than those of the so-called Maghreb, the North African countries. So it's considered part of the Middle East. And that stretches from Egypt to, in the west, to Iran and Afghanistan in the east. The MENA region is primarily inhabited by Arabs. There are various tens of millions of Turks and Persians also. Those are the second and third largest population groups. And then there are also Jews in Israel, Kurds, maybe 4 or 5 million Kurds in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. And other smaller groups such as the Baluchis and the Assyrians and others. Religiously, the MENA region is overwhelmingly Muslim. However, having said that, it is divided into the two great Muslim sects, which are entirely antagonistic towards each other. That is the Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims. The Shia are almost absent in North Africa, in the Maghreb. In the Middle East, they are dominant in Iran and Iraq, and there are many Shia also in Syria, Lebanon, and Bahrain. There are about 10 million Christians in Egypt. There are about 7.5 million Jews in Israel, and there is a substantial Druze population in Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Having said that, we should say a word or two about the situation of the Gulf states. That is Kuwait, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar particularly, which have very large populations of workers from countries such as Pakistan, India, and as far east as the Philippines. These people, particularly in the United Arab Emirates and in Qatar, outnumber the actual citizens of those countries, but they, of course, are not considered citizens, and they don't have the rights and privileges of citizens of those countries. But then there are many of them are Muslims, but there are also Hindus and Christians and others. Okay. As always, before starting on the main topic of this month's talk, I'm going to mention the principal event that took place in the MENA region between last month's talk and today. And that certainly is the trip by President Biden to Israel and Saudi Arabia, which just took place earlier this week. We're going to divide this into two parts, the Israeli part of it and the Saudi part of it, because the trips were very different in terms of their results. In terms of the Israeli trip, there were good results and not so good results. Biden presented the Israelis with a written agreement for the first time. It's not a very formal document. It's not an executive order. It's not certainly an act of Congress, but it does put down on paper for the very first time that Israel and the United States have a strategic alliance. And the cosmetics of the trip were very good, mostly in Israel, including a touching moment when he greeted two Holocaust survivors and spent a lot of time with them, much more than it was supposed to be. On the other hand, there was problems with reference to his interaction with Palestinians. In the first place, he took the Israeli, when he visited an Arab hospital in East Jerusalem, and now this is not in the West Bank, this is East Jerusalem, he took off the Israeli flag from his limousine. This did not go over well in Israel, as you can imagine. He announced a substantial contribution to the hospital, and later in his conversations with the president of the Palestinian Authority, he mentioned a contribution to the UNRWA, the UNRWA, the UN Relief Authority for Palestinians. This is directly contrary to the Taylor-Force Act, and a lot of people think that it's an illegal move on the part of the Biden administration. And a very interesting and important thing to note is that the Arab countries have almost completely ceased to contribute to UNRWA. The only country that's still making the only Arab country that is still making contributions to UNRWA is Algeria. All the rest of them have stopped making contributions, and it is quite noticeable that the Arab countries, along with the Abraham Accords and so on and so forth, Israel, have pretty much given up on the Palestinian cause. Now, moving on to his visit to Saudi Arabia, that can only be considered something of a diplomatic disaster. He made a fundamental error when he met with the Crown Prince, and started out the conversation by talking about the Khashoggi murder, and said that the CIA blamed the Crown Prince as the author of the murder of Khashoggi. Well, if you want to get something from or anything from the person you're negotiating with, you don't start out by attacking him. And he could have brought it up, and later on in the conversation, after talking about mutual interests vis-a-vis Iran, for example, and encouraging further rapprochement with Israel, and the possibility of increasing oil production, and then brought it up later in a discussion of human rights in general, and started even that aspect by congratulating the Crown Prince on the progress that he's made in the last couple of years, particularly in such areas as women's rights, and then mentioned the Khashoggi thing. But no, he started off with it at the very beginning, and he had to say that the CIA has decided that the Crown Prince was behind the whole thing. Well, it's interesting that the Crown Prince responded to this opening attack on the part of Biden by saying, in the first place, Mr. President, and he went on about the trials that took place in Saudi Arabia of those who committed the murder and those who commanded them and so on, and that they had been tried. Many of them had been convicted, and those convicted were in jail. Secondly, he said, as far as the CIA is concerned, it's my understanding that the CIA also announced after 9/11 that the Iraqis had the weapons of mass destruction. And of course, we now know that they had no weapons of mass destruction. But on the basis of that, the United States has spent tens of billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives pursuing the will-o'-the-wisp that resulted from that faulty information. Anyhow, he gets a B for this Israeli part of the trip and a solid F for the Saudi part of it. And in fact, because of that, he really came away with nothing from the Saudi meetings. No increase in oil production, no immediate continuation of the recent progress towards a rapprochement and joining the Abraham Accords with Israel. And in fact, it may very well have led to the Crown Prince saying it's unlikely to take place until there's an agreement with the Palestinians. He might very well have not said that if Biden had not utilized such terrible negotiating techniques. Okay, let's pause here. And Sean, are you on?
Yes, sir, I'm on.
Is there anybody to take questions? Okay, let's see if anyone has questions about the Biden trip before we get into today's main topic.
It does not look like we have any questions on the Zoom or on our Facebook, so I think we are good to keep chugging along.
Okay. In that case, we will start with our discussion of the main topic of this month's talk, which is external conflicts in the MENA region. First of all, two general considerations that need to be mentioned right at the beginning. First, most, but not all, external conflicts in the MENA region are external involvement in internal conflicts. In other words, it's not a strictly state versus state. It's state versus another state that is having internal problems and it's being interfered with from the outside. Secondly, most, but not all, external conflicts in the MENA region are reflections of the Sunni-Shia split in Islam. Okay, that being said, those general considerations being kept in mind, let's talk about external conflicts in the MENA region. Starting in the far west, Morocco and Algeria have been in conflict for years over what is called the Western Sahara region. In the 1970s, when the Spanish evacuated the Western Sahara, which is the area south of Morocco proper, Morocco occupied it. And there was an indigenous independence movement that was supported by Mauritania and particularly by Algeria, called the Polisario movement. At this point, Morocco controls about 3/4 of the territory, including the entire seacoast. and the Polisario Front controls the rest of it. And there has been constant conflict, diplomatic, political conflict between Morocco and Algeria ever since. Now, during the Trump administration, the United States recognized Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. This was a very significant move. Not many countries have recognized Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. It certainly had improved relations very greatly and facilitated the entry of Morocco into the Abraham Accords with Israel. And that has incidentally flourished and become very cordial. There are now not only all kinds of political and economic and trade agreements between Israel and Morocco, and a fairly large number of commercial deals between Moroccan and Israeli companies. But there is a substantial defense cooperation between the two countries. The chief of staff of the Israeli armed forces is in Morocco right now. And there is a defense agreement between the two countries. And the chief of staff of the Moroccan army is going to be coming to Israel soon. It's really not only that, but the monarch, the king of Morocco, just a couple of days ago, announced the establishment of several committees and commissions to improve the position of the Jewish community in Morocco. This, of course, was greeted with great pleasure by Israel. This is angering the Algerians tremendously. On the other hand, it will undoubtedly, because of the technical assistance that the Israelis are now going to be giving to the Moroccans, will strengthen the position of Morocco and vis-a-vis Algeria and in the Western Sahara in general. But there's certainly no likelihood that there's going to be any rapprochement between Algeria and Morocco anytime soon. And Algeria remains one of the most anti-Israel of the Arab countries. Okay, continuing in the Maghreb, there has been substantial Turkish involvement in Libya. Libya is one of the failed states in the MENA region, along with Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria. Following the downfall of Gaddafi, Libya has actually been divided into east and west portions. The western portion of the country has the government that is recognized by the international community, the United Nations, and so on. The eastern half of the country is controlled by a government which is run by a charismatic military leader named, I can't think of his name right now, it doesn't matter. Anyway, Haftar, and who was exiled, and he was a Libyan officer, general. He got into a conflict with Gaddafi and fled to the United States. After Gaddafi fell, he went back to Libya, and he and his forces control pretty much the eastern half of the country. So the outside influence in Libya has been largely coming from Turkey. Now, Turkey, of course, is part of the MENA region, but it is one of the two imperialist countries in the MENA region, the other being Iran, and we'll get to that later. And Turkey has been very much involved under the Erdogan government throughout the MENA region, and in the North African part of it, primarily with reference to Libya, and Turkey has been supporting the Libyan government. Haftar was about to take over everything when the Turks intervened and changed the military situation on the ground, and he was driven back to the eastern part of the country. At any rate, this is certainly an external involvement in Libya, although not from the MENA region itself. Yemen, which is another failed state in the Middle East. 3 countries, all from the Middle East, have been interfering in Yemen. There has been a civil war in Yemen for years between the internationally recognized government and a Shia group called the Houthis. The Houthis have taken over a good part of the country, including the capital, Sana'a. The formal government controls the southern part of the country. And the Houthis are supported by Iran financially and militarily. And the government has been supported by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, primarily from the outside. Right now, there is a ceasefire that is enforced, and hopefully this is going to lead to some kind of agreement between the battling parties. It's hard to see exactly what this would result in, because the Houthis either take over the country or they don't take over the country. And the Iranians are of course pushing the Houthis to continue with their efforts to take over the whole country. And it's hard to see what kind of agreement they could come to. But this is something that's festering there in the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. And will probably continue for God knows how long. Okay, Lebanon is another failed state. It is basically controlled by the terrorist organization Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is backed by Iran. At this point, the Iranian involvement in Lebanon is pushed back by a number of countries, particularly in the case of Lebanon, France, because they were the mandatory in Lebanon, and they feel responsible to some extent. Nevertheless, the Lebanese government really controls not much of anything. The Lebanese armed forces are much less powerful than Hezbollah, and the government is basically, the country is basically bankrupt. Certainly, this is a very substantial problem in the Middle East because of its effect on both Syria and particularly Israel, because the southern part of Lebanon is totally controlled by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is hostile to Israel. They have thousands of missiles and rockets that have been supplied to them by Iran. And it's quite conceivable, in fact, likely, I would say, at some point, if the Iranian government feels threatened in some way, that they would tell their proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, to attack Israel simultaneously. And that would be a very serious problem for Israel, because even though Israel has some of the most advanced anti-missile and anti-rocket systems in the world, when you're facing an enemy which fire 1,000 rockets a day at you from both north and south, the only real effective defense against this is what's being worked on now by Israel, which is the most advanced country in this area of military technology, and that is laser defense, because a laser cannon can fire any number of times. A anti-missile missile can be fired once. It destroys the incoming missile or rocket, and then it's gone. Whereas a laser gun can fire many times and destroy many rockets and missiles coming in at any height. And the anti-missile systems are limited in their depending on which kind you're using, and the height of the rockets and missiles it can destroy. And that technology is now very advanced. The tests have been all successful, and it has gone into production. And this is something that's also of very great interest to the United States because of the new rocket technology, some of which come in under the radar and some of which come in so high that they go over. And the anti-missile system, which is in place in the United States, is unable to cope with this. Whereas if the US had this kind of laser defense, it would be much safer. Okay. Another of the failed states in the Middle East is Syria. Syria has been in the midst of a civil war for years, and it's being interfered with just about everybody, particularly the Turks, the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Iranians. There are a substantial number of Shia in Syria. There are also a substantial number of Kurds in Syria who are very much against the Syrian government. The Syrian government at this point controls maybe 30 to 35% of the country. The rest of the country is controlled by various proxies of the Turks, of the Saudis, and of the Iranians. And Israel constantly attacks through its Air Force Iranian facilities in Syria. And then the other very significant outside influence in Syria is from Russia. The Russians have a naval and air base in Syria, both on the coast. For the first time in history, Russia has a presence in the Mediterranean, a military presence. This is something that the Russians have wanted for centuries. Now, obviously the Israelis avoid putting any of the Russian facilities in danger. The Turks leave them alone, and the Iranians don't like it, but there's nothing much they can do about it. However, it has affected the Israeli attitude towards the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. The Israelis have an agreement with the Iranian facility. Now, if Israel came out very strongly in favor of Ukraine and provided Ukraine with military equipment or technology, the Russians would certainly eliminate that agreement with Israel. This would be very difficult for Israel. And this is why the Israeli involvement in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has been limited to humanitarian measures. Israelis set up a hospital in Ukraine to treat the wounded, the war wounded. It has accepted a large number of the Ukrainian refugees and has provided protective equipment for the Ukrainian armed forces, but no offensive equipment or technology. Okay. Iraq. Iraq is one of the two countries in the Middle East that is predominantly Shia. The other one, of course, being Iran. And following the downfall of Saddam Hussein due to the American invasion, which was supposedly because of his weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be non-existent. And the U.S. has been involved there for ever since. And that's 2001 to 2002 to today, so it's over 20 years now. The Iranian involvement is constant. It supports the various Shia movements in Iraq. There are numerous frontier incidents, and it recently has been attacking the Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq. That this is something which is very serious. Iraq is the Iraqi government is stronger than the Syrian government, the Yemeni government, or the Lebanese government, but it still is under serious attack by not only the Iranians but by their proxies within the country, and that is a serious problem. Okay. Now, a few words about the role of the non-MENA countries. The United States, Europe, Russia, and China in all these conflicts, Morocco, Algeria, Syria, Lebanon, and others. As far as the Morocco-Algerian conflict is concerned, Algeria has no outside supporters. No other countries support the Algerian position. They may not, and most of them do not, recognize Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, but they're not supporters of Algeria in terms of the conflict between Algeria and Morocco. On the other hand, not only the United States, but also particularly in Europe, France and Spain are very strong supporters of the Moroccan government. The Russians and the Chinese have not been particularly involved at all in that particular conflict. On the other hand, as I pointed out, Russia and to some extent, Russia is very much involved in Syria, and Russia and to some extent France are involved in Lebanon, and the Chinese penetration into the Middle East, the MENA region in general, is almost entirely economic and cultural. There have been many very large Chinese investments, particularly in the Middle East, not so much in North Africa, and large attempts to spread the Chinese culture through Confucian institutes and by other means. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the role of non-state actors in the various parts of the MENA region and their cross-border activities. First of all, some that I've already mentioned, Hezbollah and Hamas. Hezbollah certainly, which is located primarily in southern Lebanon, but also has a presence in southern Syria, is an Iranian proxy and is a constant threat to Israel. Hamas, and it's a Shia movement. Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which despite being Sunni, is supported by Iran and supplied militarily and financially by the Iranians. And another terrorist group that operates in Gaza called Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is smaller than Hamas, but still dangerous. And again, this is primarily a threat to Israel, but it's also a threat to Egypt. And both Israel and Egypt have established blockades of Gaza, and the Hamas has thousands of rockets and missiles, not as many as Hezbollah, but a very large, substantial number. Then you have organizations, terrorist organizations like Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was thrown out of Afghanistan. It's now very much back in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over after the United States abandoned the country last year. And there are now 3 groups contending for control of Afghanistan. One is the Taliban, of course. One is Al Qaeda, which is very strong in parts of Afghanistan. And the third group, which operates from the north of Afghanistan, including the remnants of the army and other groups, anti-Pashtun groups that are operating out of northern Afghanistan against the Taliban government. So Al Qaeda is by no means gone. It is very much alive and is present also very much in Syria. It controls part of Syria through different groups. It also is active in North Africa, unlike most of the non-state actors, and even has a presence in various African countries south of the Sahara. And finally, we can mention ISIS, Islamic State, which, despite the fact that its caliphate was destroyed, it continues to exist, and it continues to interfere in the various countries of the Middle East, not so much in North Africa, but in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon, but mostly in Syria and Iraq, as well as to some extent in the Gulf region. I think at this point, what I will do is open up the floor for questions and comments, discussion in general.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. It doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat right now, either on the Zoom or on Facebook. But if there were any, any more remarks you wanted to give regarding either the failed states or just general external conflicts in the MENA region that you think our audience would like to take away, feel free to do that as well.
Okay, I think it's obvious to you from what I've said so far that the conflict situation in the MENA region is extremely complex. There are outside actors, there are inside imperialist powers, there are failed states, and there are non-state actors. They're all operating all over the place. Now, more so in some areas than in others. In North Africa, The main country that's affected this way is Libya. Now, having said that, Tunisia, which a lot of people thought was going to become a democratic country after the so-called Arab Spring, is now retrogressing into authoritarianism. And there is a lot of opposition, internal opposition to the current government, and democratic movements and other sorts of movements. And it's quite conceivable that outside countries, particularly Algeria, might start interfering in Tunisia. It's also conceivable the Turks might get involved. Some of the European countries, perhaps. But other than that, and Libya, the North African region is considerably less complex than the Middle East region in MENA. In the Middle East, you have all of these forces operating simultaneously in various parts of the region. It ranges from countries like the United Arab Emirates, which are peaceful and prosperous, and is a member of an Abraham Accord with Israel. And even though it's involved with Yemen, it has been able to maintain fairly good relations with Iran. That same is true of Oman, which is a Gulf state and the very bottom of the the southeast of the Arabian Peninsula. Oman is peaceful and prosperous, and it also has been able to maintain pretty good relations with Iran. Kuwait, which is at the top of the Gulf, which is not particularly friendly to Israel, and has not joined the Abraham Accords, feels that it has to keep good relations with Iran because it's practically on the border with Iran, not quite, but almost. And we know, of course, that it was rescued from Saddam Hussein by the Western powers in the first Bush administration, and so on and so forth. But it is also a prosperous, stable country. Saudi Arabia is prosperous and pretty much at peace, although the Houthis have sent some rockets over, and this has been something of a problem. But that hasn't happened for a while, and by and large, so you have by and large the Gulf states and including Saudi Arabia that are in pretty good shape with reference to the Middle East in general, and Israel, which is democratic and prosperous, is also stable. The rest of the Middle East is a disaster area. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran and Turkey. The Turks and the Iranians are interfering everywhere, but they have serious internal problems. The economic situation in both countries is very, very bad. Most don't realize that the ethnic Persians are only about half the population of Iran. The other half are Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, and Baluchis. The Arabs, Kurds, and Azeris are in the northeast and northwest. I'm sorry, and the Baluchis are in the southeast. And particularly the Kurds, the Arabs, and the Baluchis are anti the Iranian government. And a very large percentage of the Persian people have also, because they feel that the theological dictatorship has really destroyed much of the glorious history of Persia for millennia, are very anti-government. It's not widely known that about 4 years ago, the Iranian army, which is separate from the Revolutionary Guard, tried to stage a coup. The coup was put down by the Revolutionary Guard, which is actually larger and better equipped than the regular armed forces. And of course, the regular Army, Navy, and Air Force were purged afterwards. Nevertheless, there is such constant demonstrations and riots in the Iranian cities over the economic situation, and often it gets political, and people are yelling down with the mullahs and so on and so forth. That it's quite conceivable that there might be a coup d'état in Tehran, and the overthrow of the Islamic government in Tehran. And that leads to one of the most dangerous situations potentially in the Middle East, which is if the Iranian government feels threatened, it may try to divert attention by attacking Israel, and by telling, both directly and by telling its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, to simultaneously attack Israel. And having said that, let me just say a few words before wrapping up about the Palestinian situation. As I'm sure you all know, the Palestinians are divided into three groups. The refugees, who exist all over the Middle East, and have not been given citizenship by any of the countries in the Middle East except for Jordan. What is called the West Bank, which is Sahara and Judea, which is governed by the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, and the Gaza Strip, which is governed by a terrorist organization, Hamas. The Hamas and the Palestinian Authority hate each other. This is the good news. The bad news is that Hamas is much more powerful than the Palestinian Authority, and if elections were ever held in the West Bank, Hamas would almost certainly win, which is why the Palestinian Authority has postponed elections multiple times in the last couple of decades. But this again is a situation that is very much a problem with reference to outside countries interfering. Less so, that tendency is now improved because many of the Arab countries have basically given up on the Palestinians, and they have much less support from the Arab world than they used to have. And Israel is doing much better with the Arab countries than it used to. So there is both good and bad news in that particular situation. Let me stop here and see, have any questions come in or
Yes, we
comments?
actually had, two questions came in, one from the Zoom and one from the Facebook. We'll start with the one on the Facebook one. Do you have anything to say about the status of the petrodollar after the Biden visit?
The status of what?
The petrodollar.
petrodollar?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, if I understand what you mean by the petrodollar, I would say that because the Biden visit to Saudi Arabia was really a complete nothing. I mean, in fact, if anything, it made the situation worse. Saudi Arabia is not going to increase oil production. It won't have any effect whatsoever on the situation with reference to shortages of oil and gas in Europe or in the United States.
Okay. And our second question is, what are the geopolitical or security concerns with Jordan given Iraq's Basra Aqaba oil pipeline within the context of the MENA region?
Well, I think that that's a good question because of the pipeline situation is very interesting. There's not only that situation in the eastern part of the region, but there's also the situation of the gas being discovered and being exploited by Israel, Egypt, and Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was supposed to reach Europe by a pipeline through Cyprus and Greece into the rest of Europe. But the United States, the Biden administration withdrew the support of the United States from that pipeline. So now the Turks are desperately trying to improve relations with Israel because they would like that pipeline to go through Turkey and so on. The problem, of course, is that nobody trusts Erdogan anymore about anything. Are there any other questions or comments?
That looks to be it.
Okay. In that case, I look forward to seeing you all a month from now.
Yes. So thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
very much.
And thank you to everybody that joined us today. We appreciate everyone joining our sponsor talk from the Institute of World Politics. We're a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs, and we offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 that are online, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you are at all interested in attending any upcoming events, I know we have 3 more with Dr. Bailey in the next 3 months. Making a gift to IWP or applying to one of our graduate programs, please feel free to visit iwp.edu. And like always, thank you for joining us here for one of our sponsored lecture events. And thank you again, Dr. Bailey.